So the title of my talk is Why Contact Researchers Who Cultivate a Geographic Imagination. And that's really all I want to do. I want to kind of give you I know this is a bit of a niche interest, so I want to give you a sense of why I think it's an important sort of thing to do. Let me start with an example. So I've only ever flown once in business class, and it was a very beautiful experience. I thought I wouldn't like it because I'm against my socialist ideals and all that sort of thing, but actually it was wonderful. It was a trip home to South Africa, and basically I was upgraded because I was flying a lot to South Africa in those days to visit my mom and dad when they were alive, and I turned left into business class, and it was like another world. Big seats, comfort, menus, and while all the economy class people were being herded like cattle into economy class, I got a taste of what it was like to be up there with lots of leg room and a menu. And very quickly, I found I fell into that kind of role of business class flyer, and looking at the menu, should I have the duck or the salmon? Delightful. In a way, that encapsulates most of what I want to say, just that example. How the very simple division into economy and business class, turning left, some people go there, some people go to the other side. In some planes, there's a little curtain that gets drawn in the smaller planes. In the big planes, it's quite obvious which area is which and so forth. It creates a kind of a sense of situated privilege. It creates a form of spatial inequality. In many ways, that's captures for me why we should be interested in, as contact researchers, in space. There was a nice study a couple of years ago. Why won't this work? I think, yeah, there we go. Conducted by Discussant and Morton. I thought it was a very witty study. They looked at the records of millions of flights, and they found something quite interesting, which seemed to be related to this thing, the example I've just given you, that on flights where there was, in fact, a business first-class cabins, airage was more likely in economy class. In fact, it was 3.84 times more likely. And Discussant and Morton, I think, rather delightfully point out that this was roughly the equivalent of size of effect of a 9-hour delay. In addition, even more interesting for us, I think. Why is this not working? So I seem to be freezing the whole time, and it does normally work perfectly. Let's have a look. There we go. When in fact there was front boarding procedures, so that means people are going in the front, they're having to walk all the way through business class. So they're getting to see those other people sitting there and see the opulence and the better conditions. In fact, this in turn was more likely to create air rage. The conditional probabilities went up. So, of course, the public transport seating arrangement has a kind of more serious and longer term history. The contact research sort of tradition was born in the US around about the time when Jim Crow race laws were still being applied. In fact, many contact researchers contributed to the downfall of Jim Crow race laws. And one of them, the most notorious examples of this kind of micro level segregation of transport space was the white precedence rule, which you'll all know about. Under Jim Crow, basically, black people had to enter and move to the back of a bus. And on crowded buses, they even had it was like a little seat top sign that kind of they could move forwards and backwards to indicate where the boundary line was. Now, this was obviously an incredibly inefficient way to run public transport. It meant half empty buses, it meant queuing in complicated ways and so forth. But nevertheless, it was imposed. And of course, the question is why? Well, it was part of a logic of racial division. Mary Jackman, in her book, The Velvet Glove, suggests actually a lot of time was spent on these kind of small divisions between people because in public spaces, people were tended to meet not in existing, very firmly established sort of status relations of boss versus employee or something like that. They were meeting as private citizens, and therefore, in order to maintain that kind of status hierarchy between white and black, these small laws like the white precedence law became incredibly important. And of course, they had devastating psychological impacts. And that was one of the things that was raised in the famous Brown versus the Board of Education case. So Crossack did a study in which he interviewed lots of African-American travelers, and he said very often, perhaps surprisingly, the form of segregation that annoyed them the most, the one that had the most negative impacts, was this form of segregation on buses and on public transport. And he suggests that he drew on Festinger, his social comparison theory. It's an old theory. It was one of the foundations of social identity theory later on. He's saying, look, when African American people come onto these buses, of course, immediately space cues these racial categories. It tells people you're at the back, you've got low status, you're inferior. It constantly renders these category comparisons salient, if you like, in our terms. In social identity terms, this is normative fit. Also, comparative fit is very high. Another just example of the same thing, just in case you think it's all an historical example. This is from Israel. So about 20 or so years, or 30 or so years ago, there was an interesting thing began to happen on bus routes through parts of Jerusalem and other places, other cities in Israel. And that is, there was a kind of reemergence of a form of gender segregation on public transport. Particularly in buses that went through Haredi, ultra-Orthodox Jewish areas. And it emerged so that basically female passengers were expected to not only dress modestly, but also sit at the back of the bus, whereas men would sit at the front of the bus. And this was enforced by kind of self-appointed morality police, women who transgressed that role were often subject to abuse, basically. They were told to sit at the back. Sometimes worse than that. And in about 2011, this practice was outlawed because several women, in fact, I think Rosa, I can't remember her name now. Anyway, there's a very famous case where a woman was sitting in an empty bus in an ultra-Orthodox area and basically was told to move to the back, refused to move to the back. A crowd of men formed outside the bus. Told her to move to the back. Fair play to her, she didn't move to the back. The police were called, and she pointed out that under Israeli law, there was no compunction for her to move to the back of the bus. The police eventually gave up trying to get her to move to the back of the bus, and this became a court case, which eventually led to this practice being outlawed. But of course, it's still practiced informally in areas. And it's claimed by proponents that it's basically a voluntary expression of modesty, which tells you something about gender relations. Other people argue that no, this is a form of gendered inclusion. It's like pushing religious values and patriarchal values, they would argue, onto secular public space. So in a way, I've kind of covered the terrain I want to cover, because with an audience as wise and up-to-date and knowledgeable as you will be able to fill in a lot of the blanks about why this sort of thing might be interesting to contact theorists. I guess what I'm going to really do now is just simply add a little bit of meat onto this bone. So I'm going to discuss three topics. The first one I'm going to title The Unimagined Geographies of Social Psychology, and I'm going to explore four ways in which we as a discipline have explored social space and not explored it. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to end that section by rereading a famous study by Deutsch and Collins, which you'll be familiar with. I'm then going to say a little bit about some of the work we've done in South Africa and some of the work we've done in Belfast. This is really just by way of exemplification. I'm not going to take my research project or something as the serious bit of the talk, but merely just as illustrations. Okay. So here's four ways in which space can be conceived. The first way, unfortunately, is the way that most social psychologists have treated it. Most social psychologists working in the area of intergroup relations have treated it, and that's in a minimalist way. And sorry, I've adapted this taxonomy from someone called Daniel Stockels, who a long time ago was writing about this sort of space, and I tip my hat to Daniel. So the minimalist notion of space is, in this kind of notion, basically our social relationships, our forms of contact, our identities, and so forth. Space just is the background to those. So it almost becomes like it's a container in which things happen, nothing more than that. So it's like a contextual wallpaper. And I think most of our experimental work's like that. An awful lot of our other work's like that too. Space is just, we know it's there and we know things happen in it, but it doesn't really play a role in how we think about intergroup relations, including contact. So it's like contextual wallpaper. Now, I say experiments are like this, but of course some experiments aren't like that. I've seen very interesting virtual reality studies and also lab experiments that use space and measure it and think about it in a different way. So it's not all work. The second way we've conceptualized space, and this is the bit I think that contact theorists have taken seriously, and there's a lot of work on this, which is we thought of space sort of instrumentally. Space segregation divides people, and therefore spaces can be organized in ways which encourage them to interact with one another. So that's certainly something. Proximity and its role, functional proximity particularly, and its role has been considered in our literature quite a bit. And we'll see Deutsch and Collins' classic study looked at that in some detail. The distinction between functional and just physical proximity, I think, is interesting because that was introduced again by Festinger. He was a very productive human being. He did a very famous book-length treatment of a study he did. The book was called Social Pressures in Informal Groups. I've got it here. In fact, I hooked it out to have a quick look. And basically in this book, he says, look, it's not just how close people are, it's whether space affords them opportunities to interact. So for example, someone who lives in a ground floor near a stairwell is likely to meet people coming, as they come out of their house, coming down the stairwell more than someone who's merely physically, as you measure, going to meet them. And there was a lovely study done recently by Matt Easterbrook and Vivian Vignoles entitled When Friendship Goes Down the Toilet. Lovely title. Fair play to them for that title. Made me smile. And what they did was they did a longitudinal study of relations in different sorts of student accommodation. And what they found is that when students lived in accommodation that had common areas, so i.e. they could meet and sit together, and also when those areas didn't have en suites where people had to go and shower and so forth in communal areas too, those students tended to have stronger relationships with one another and interesting, reported higher levels of well-being. So the idea here is that space instrumentally encourages certain forms of relations and contact to occur. So then the third sense, and this is what Stockles was most interested in, is the idea that space, he called it spiritual. Space is not just about bringing us together functionally, for example. It's not minimalist. It embeds these deep-seated meanings. It's the human geography of everyday lives are part of our identities. They inscribe somehow our values. Places inscribe norms. And I've used the example of home there. I'll give you a personal example. So I grew up in a small village in Northern Ireland called Ballynewer. No one will have heard of it. And there's a river in Ballynewer that I used to go fishing in. So when I think, it's called the 6 Mile Water. When I think of my home and growing up, I think very much of the time I spent in this river. And we all have certain attachments to home spaces, to certain kinds of landscapes. It might be urban spaces for other people and so forth. So this is this idea that there's somehow more. And so I want to think about how that something more might be linked to contact. But that's a rather innocent interpretation of space. So I'm going to add something to Stockles' taxonomy. He did minimalist, instrumental, and spiritual. But I'm going to suggest that we also, as social psychologists and political psychologists, need to think about space as being implicated in relations of power and status, relations of segregation and exclusion. And of course, for contact researchers like us, this notion of a politicized space, a space being about power and status as well as just spiritual, instrumental, and minimalist, I think is very important. And we've already begun to glimpse that dimension, if you like, of the spatial world. The example of the airplane into economy class versus business class, women expected to enter the bus and sit at the back, and so forth. Those are all examples, I would say, where you have to in some way grasp the political dimension. And so Dutch and Collins. I'm going to use this as an example of how a geographic imagination can even enrich our understanding of older work. And I very much like this. Stefania Paolini and I have just written a chapter on this study, this original study. I think it's a very good example of classic contact work. And it's often cited as one of our foundational studies. And what they did was Mary Evan Collins and Morton Deutsch explored relations in 4 public housing projects in New York, one city, and Newark, which is a neighboring city. They're focusing mainly on white attitudes and what happened as white people lived in these different kinds of projects, what happened to their attitudes towards African American people. And this was the context in which that the study unfolded. Essentially, this is a recent, well, not that recent, but it's a dot map of the distribution residential demography of different groups living in New York. New York is known as a very cosmopolitan, diverse city, but what's perhaps less well known is it's one of the most segregated cities in the US, and this is where Dutch and Collins' study was located. This is a classic pattern, by the way, spatially. Of many American cities, you get an inner city area where you've got a high clustering of ethnic minority groups. You've got suburbs which are predominantly white. And, you know, I could spend an hour talking about how this sort of geography comes to be. And part of it, there's also a psychological story here, though it's also institutional and to do with inequality. This is the context in which Deutsch and Collins did the research. And what they were interested in exploring is they were taking advantage of a natural field experiment almost. The federal government had pumped lots of money into public housing projects for poorer people. And in New York, those housing projects took the form of integrated projects. Black and white people lived not only in the same neighborhood, but also in the same tenement blocks, flat blocks, housing units. And so they were living in a space where you'd imagine there was lots of interaction. But in another city in New York, there was the other 2 housing projects. People were in the same neighborhood, but they were divided into different sections. So they lived together, but with a kind of spatial division. They didn't live in the same buildings. And this is what Dutch and Collins find. You'll know this research well. They find that people who had close proximity had more contact, understandably, and that contact in turn was associated with more positive attitudes, more positive stereotypes of their neighbors, their Black neighbors, and so forth. And I noticed this one, Bakerville and Frankville, these 2 projects, with the absolute, almost entire, complete absence of contact. And I've always found that strange. I want you to bear that in mind as I go on. How come you can live in the same neighborhood? And it's difficult to know exactly what the topography of this neighborhood was. If you read the book, they're quite vague about it, but it was clear that they were living close to each other, separated mainly by some sports facilities. They had shared common roads and so forth. And their kids went to the same schools, actually, in both Coletown, Sacktown, Bakerville, and Frankville. All the children went to integrated schools. So they're living close together, but having almost no contact in one and a bit of contact in the other. So here's how the spatial thing might feature. And I'm going to be a little bit speculative here. It's my rereading of Dutch and Collins. I'm going to go beyond what they say to looking at what they imply. I would argue that in that pattern of results you've just seen, that pattern is not only a result of contact per se, but it's also, it is partly that, yes, functional proximity, living in a building with people does create more interaction, which does change people's attitudes. But also, I would argue that the architecture and layout of the 2 projects communicated something about the value and importance and significance of integration. It communicated something about the social norms, that the spaces themselves, the way they were designed, communicated values, the value of integration. And this is part of the story. And in fact, I believe that Deutsch and Collins recognized this. I refer you particularly to chapter 6, when they almost say what I've just said. And I would argue also there may be the case for saying that in the biracial layout, this particular layout where you've got separated people living close together, but separated into different areas with sports fields and roads between them, did this create a kind of sense of territoriality, our space versus their space? Did this then shape people's willingness to cross the line over into their space to have contact? I think it did, and there's different kinds of evidence you can draw on if you from a rereading of their work. The first thing is if you actually look at the interviews, they're constantly referring to people from the other side, our side and their side. The second bit of evidence is that, and I think this is an interesting finding, is that the children of, they also interviewed children, although that never makes the standard textbook treatments. They interviewed 50 children of belonging to different sorts of projects. These kids all went to integrated schools, so they met and interacted in school. But when they came home, not a single child in the segregated projects had a friend over from school, none. Whereas this was very commonplace in the integrated projects. And in fact, the children themselves said, you know, we resent the fact that these guys have got those facilities on their side. So I think even amongst the children, there was a strong sense of territorial. And yeah, so that's kind of my spatialized rereading of a classic study. And that's now, this is now the last bit. This bit here is just the realm of pure speculation, because there's no particular evidence in the study itself that sustains that. But I would predict that the spatial design itself was associated with a kind of sense of common neighborhood identity and the integrated projects. This is our project, our space, whereas that didn't emerge by racial segregated projects. That would be my prediction, my expectation. And that's how, again, it links to contact theory, because, of course, one of our models is the common identification model, and how space links to categorization, norms, and identity. That's the kind of, so basically that's my argument, essentially. And I could, again, stop right there, because I think I've said what I want to say. But I'll just give you a few other examples from our research, just because, you know, I'm here and I may as well. So I grew up in this human geography, the apartheid city. And I lived in Cape Town I lived in Northern Ireland for the first part of my life, and I lived in Cape Town for about 15 years and went to school and university in Cape Town. And I lived in this environment. You can see why I was interested in geography. It's not that I'm particularly sensitive to it or something. It's just I lived in environments like this where there were very clear white areas. They were legally enforced. The Group Areas Act of 1951 meant that black people had to live where they were told to live, white people lived where they were told to live, and so forth. Schools were segregated legally. Beaches, public spaces were segregated legally, and so forth. So this is what the geography looks like. And when I began to study contact and desegregation, it was against this sort of backdrop of extreme legally enforced segregation, just as the early contact researchers in America did the same sort of thing. Now, things have changed a lot in South Africa. I mean, a lot. There's been, all the laws have gone. Every single one of them went between 1980 and 1996, all gone. But there's still a lot of in what we would call informal segregation, and it's very complexly caused. A lot of it's caused by enduring inequality, of course, but there's also a preferential dimension to it. People act in ways that maintain segregation, and that, as a psychologist, the bit that's interested me more. So here's an example of a form of segregation that's happening right now in Cape Town and across South Africa. So this is a good example of a new architectural form that's emerged, which is the gated community. And the people who live on this side are almost overwhelmingly Black Africans. The people who live in here, this is predominantly white, and they're not entirely white. There are rich middle class people of other races live here too. You can see there's a stark contrast. For me, this defines the psychology as well as it's just not only economic. One wonders what this does to the relations that communities have with one another. So this is a buffer zone. This area is a deliberate area you're not allowed to build on. And of course, this is a fenced community where access is strictly regulated. So that's the kind of, if you like, the enduring context in which we've done our work. So we've done some work in various settings, mostly looking at interactions at quite a micro scale. So I think that's our space as contact researchers, that kind of micro space where people are together but acting in ways that remain apart. I think that's an important sort of level of analysis for us. And it's the level of analysis that's often left out in urban geography, urban sociology, and so forth. This is our space. So we've been interested in what happens at this kind of fine level of granularity, particularly in what we've called a microecologies of contact, this kind of micro level interactional stuff. I've already showed you several examples. The airplane is an example, the buses are an example, and so forth. So basically, this is a system where it gets quite close to what we call preferential segregation. It's a system where people are co-present, co-located, but somehow act in ways behaviorally that maintain separation. So it's what I call microkinetic behaviors. It's to do with the placement often of the body, the orientation of the body, the timing and spacing of people's movements within spaces, how they occupy spaces, and so forth. So here's an example of a space. This is taken from a study done by Colin Trudeau, led by Colin Trudeau, that I was part of. This is a public space in which young people are sitting around, as you can see. Colin adapted a kind of time series geographic study where he took photographs over a long period of time, a kind of time series analysis, and then did follow-up analyses of where people sat. For example, he looked at whether or not people are sitting in clusters, whether they use different areas of the steps, different groups. He looked at micro and molecular level patterns of entry and leaving these spaces. I'm not going to get into the details of the results. I'm just showing you the sorts of stuff we've done. This is another example. This is a student dining hall. We're in a student residence, and Lee Shrieff and colleagues, I was also part of this as a 10th author or something. Basically, she mapped over the course of a year how people sat in dining halls. This is now a newly diversified space, often in South Africa, as in fact in Northern Ireland. People are educated very much in segregated environments, but universities are a kind of transition moment where they enter joint spaces. So Lee mapped patterns of segregation and contact at this sort of level, at level of who you eat with, and what side of the hall you sit in. We, of course, did a study on beaches. This is, I don't need to really analyze the pattern. It's pretty straightforward. But basically, this was a formerly white beach under apartheid legislation. And we did observational work which plotted where people sat. And we also spent quite a long time interviewing people on the beachfront itself. We did 140 interviews over time, over different parts of the day, and asked people what their understanding of this kind of very clear pattern of segregation was. And we find that white and black occupants of the beach had quite different takes on what was going on. White people consistently articulated a sense of being pushed off the beach, that they were being displaced, that people weren't obeying normal beach etiquette in terms of how they used space, how they dressed, loud music, a whole bunch of things to do with this kind of violation of situated norms, place norms of how to behave on beaches. For black beachgoers, this was framed quite differently in incredibly positive terms, as an opportunity, as a sign that apartheid was ending. But, and this is the point about the microecological stuff, they noticed, obviously, that white people were withdrawing from them, that they were recreating segregation by sitting further away, by leaving when the beach got crowded, and so forth. So this is, if you like, the context in which patterns of contact are emerging. Yeah. So to sum up this whole bit, practices of microecology, why are they interesting? Well, the one thing is, of course, if you're not in proximal relation, if you're not co-located, and if you're maintaining segregation in these various ways, you're not having contact. So understanding why these patterns emerge is an important question for us. But I think the geographic dimension, if you like, is interesting for other reasons. How we organize space, the meanings we give to it, are centrally implicated in a lot of the foundational work that we do on contact. They make categories salient and visible, for example, sometimes, or they create new category boundaries. They maintain relations of distance and hierarchy. I would argue they actually embody the abstract ideology of race. So if you think of Jim Crow racism, the white preference rule on those buses in the southern states, that was literally embedding an ideology in everyday space. And that's why that ideology becomes so powerful, I think. Um, yeah, and it means that once those groups are formed and those spaces are formed as divided, then contact itself has to cross a line. And in a different talk, I would talk about that idea that contact is a boundary transgressive phenomenon. Okay, so this is just for interest, apropos of nothing, to give you an idea of how this sort of work is being done in other disciplines. So this is a study by Noshan et al., and it's looking at everyday activity space segregation and contact exposure using mobile phone data, mined from a big mobile phone provider in the States. And it's using quite, I think, an interesting methodology where basically as people of different groups cross one another's pathways, it clicks as a potential contact encounter. It's psychologically, I think, still quite vacant. There's not too much we can say about the psychology. They don't gather that sort of information, but you have to give them some snaps for the scale here. So this particular study, 1.7 million Americans, and they recovered 1.6 billion encounters, and they're basically mapping contact exposure across the entire society here. And so in some ways, I'm pointing to the fact this sort of work might be integrated in interesting ways with the other more fine-grained work that we're doing. And I'll now show you, to conclude my talk, a little bit of the work that we've been doing in Northern Ireland, which has also used mobile phone technology, although not at all on such a grand scale, actually in a very focused scale. So this is our Belfast work. Belfast, as many of you will know, is an incredibly divided city and still remains divided. Shelley also comes from Northern Ireland, so she can confirm that during our little talk, our interaction afterwards. And what we did in the Belfast study was we tracked people's movements around North Belfast, which is historically divided into very much into Catholic and Protestant enclaves. We did a door-to-door survey and we did walking interviews, which I'll just mention in passing were a wonderful technique. People walk you through the local environment and talk about encounters, what the spaces mean to them, why they go somewhere and don't go other places, and so forth. And so as part of that environment that they're walking around in, North Belfast has got a lot of these, which are called peace walls. They were put up in the 1970s mostly to kind of regulate conflict between Catholic and Protestant communities at a time when there was a civil war going on, which was ended by this thing that they're calling here the Good Friday Agreement. But these walls, far from going down in peace times, have actually proliferated, and they've become a bit of an embarrassment for the local government because clearly we're meant to be an integrated society, but we've got these walls going up everywhere, and they're being made bigger. And so they've set themselves a task of removing these walls as part of the task of social change. And so these are just some to show you some methods that we've been using to explore how people actually use everyday spaces. So the right-hand side is just it's a kind of a summary, a cumulative summary of 24 million GPS data tracking points in which we had a few hundred people moving through North Belfast over a 2-week period. And the bits in pink are the bits where when they moved outside the home, emerged as being Protestant spaces. These are spaces in which basically Protestants tend to use them more and more. The turquoisey ones are Catholic spaces. These are spaces where Catholic people use them more and more. And the blue spaces, the bits where Catholic and Protestant residents share space. And you can see it's mostly big arterial routes, but also things like Tesco, which is a supermarket chain. So it's outside the kind of ethnic enclaves, if you like. And on the left just gives you an example of some data you can extract from this sort of GPS mapping type study. Many people in North Belfast told us, about 40% of them told us they had no problems in sharing spaces and moving into, for example, to go shopping in another group's area. But as you can see, the reality is something very different. They very, very rarely enter other spaces. And this is, if you like, the kind of the place identity link that goes with that pattern. So this is one of our walking interviewees saying why, when he sees the signs that you see here in this map, that is the red, white, and blue curve painting and the Union Jack flag flying, why he feels relatively safe there as though he belongs. But why, if he entered another sort of area, one that had nationalist symbolism associated with it, for example, Irish language signs or wall murals that are nationalist in orientation, then that would cause him to feel afraid, to feel alienated, to feel like he didn't belong. Okay, so last example. Why is any of this interesting in practice? Because contact research is a practical, applied area of research. We're all about not only understanding what happens when people have or don't have contact, but also how to change things. So at the minute, they've got this program in Belfast to bring down these peace walls. They're an embarrassment, as I said. It's so far they haven't made too much progress. They were meant to all be down, I think, last year. Shelley might correct me on this. They're meant to be down last year. They've only taken down a few, and the ones that they've taken down are, I would call them low-hanging fruit. They're not the important ones. They're the ones that no one really cares much about. The big ones still remain. But they've got this program to do it. And one of the things that's getting in the way of this program is that people who live in the communities close to these peace walls are resistant to them being removed. They're resistant. They're threatened by the idea that they get removed. But this is one program that's going on. As an interim measure, the government have tried this sort of thing, which is that the peace walls, there's 99 of them in and around Belfast. Some of them now have gates in them, so they're being opened, those gates, during the day. This is a famous one. This is a gate in a peace wall that runs through a park, which the park has a Catholic side and a Protestant side. And this is a park in North Belfast called Alexandra Park. And then great fanfare. Some time ago, in actual fact, they built this gate and then they opened it. And this is a picture of primary school kids running through it. And the headline here was taken from the local press at the time. Belfast Park opens door to peace. The problem is that no one walks through the park still. No one walks through this gate. We find very little evidence in our tracking studies of people actually going from one side to the other. And in our walking interview studies, we find out why. They still associate these territorial meanings with one side of the park versus another. So in our survey data, one of the things we've been interested in is how do we get people to change their mind about the removal of these boundaries? And of course, contact is one of the things that we might think about. So in our studies on peace wall, on people's opposition to or support for the removal of peace walls, what we find is as our literature would predict, positive self-reported contact is positively associated with support for their removal. And this effect's partially mediated by realistic threat. People who have good contact with others have less sense that they're a realistic threat to them. Physical safety is big in Belfast. Therefore, they support the walls coming down more. The opposite is true of negative contact. People who have more negative contact tend to have heightened realistic threat, and this in turn increases their opposition to peace wall removal. And of course, distance from the wall, a geographic variable, is also a very central predictor. Basically, the people who live closest to the walls, the ones who need to accept this change, are the ones who resist it most. But interestingly, positive contact moderates the effects of proximity, and that's, I think, a good example of how, if you like, a spatial geographic variable might interact with a contact type variable. So over here in the left-hand side, you'll see basically the locations of various participants relative to the walls. The walls are those things in red and purple. And what we find is, yes, people who are closest to the walls and who have the lowest levels of positive contact experiences with the other community, they're the ones who resisted the most. And that as they have more and better contact experiences, proximity still plays a role, but it's moderated by those positive experiences. And that's kind of an example of how we can begin to think about the space contact interactions in terms of social change. There are other things, well, sorry, this is that general point. The more general point, which is if we want to accomplish desegregation, we need to transform people's relations to place, to, for example, the walls, not just to each other. I'm thinking about that. I think it's an important applied question. And thinking about that also means we have to start thinking about how to transform people's sense of territoriality, sense of the place identity relationship. So a last example, I've got 2 minutes left. So all through Belfast, we've got these things, wall murals. It's very big in Northern Ireland. People display their collective identity, not only in space, but literally painted on spaces, on walls. And murals, they're, for many people, a deeply spiritual, in the Daniel Stockel sense, connection to place. And these murals often celebrate history. So, for example, this mural is a paramilitary mural. It celebrates the UVF, which were a fighting unit in which many men from East Belfast, the present era, died during the First World War, but then became a paramilitary group. And so this sort of wall mural would be associated with extreme threat for the Catholic community, and people who develop it know this, but it's also an extreme sense of pride and place link for people who live in East Belfast. But this is the sort of mural that people are trying to move away from. And there's something called the Re-Imaging Communities Project, which is trying to transform the visual landscape of place in ways that encourage people of both communities to share particular spaces. And they are doing so by choosing symbolism and representative people, for example, sports stars like George Best, to symbolize a kind of Northern Irish, a general Northern Irish community identity, and to get away from these sort of territorial identities and breaking that relationship between place and identity. So I won't say future directions because I think I've run out of time, but I'll put them up if you guys want. There's some of the things I would have said as things that I think might be useful for you to explore. Quite happy to share my slides afterwards, by the way, in case those directions are particularly interesting to any of you. And let me see if I can stop sharing so I can see you.